Hello and welcome to this webinar. Delighted that everyone could be here. My name is Stephen Hoffman. I'm the director of the Global Strategy Lab and a professor of global health, law, and political science at York University in Toronto, Canada. Really delighted to be hosting this webinar, which is part of a series that the Global Strategy Lab runs. Antimicrobial resistance is one of the defining global challenges of our time. It's one reason why our lab is so focused on addressing it, both in terms of the kind of research that we do as a lab, as well as our work as the WHO Collaborating Center on the global governance of antimicrobial resistance. And so today, really delighted to have this forum to talk about some great work that has recently been published on this topic. Antimicrobial resistance, unlike many other issues, is one that is actually getting worse over time. Right now, about 1.3 million people die every year from antimicrobial resistance. It's about 5 million people every year whose deaths are related to antimicrobial resistance or exacerbated by it. That number is only expected to grow by millions, actually, over the coming decades. And so, unlike, again, many issues that the world has succeeded in tackling, this is an issue that's only getting worse. And indeed, for many decades, there's been calls for a war on bugs, a war on superbugs, and billions of dollars invested in trying to contain this threat. But the numbers, the deaths, the people affected continue to grow. Injecting himself into this debate on a war on bugs, we have Dr. Isaac Weldon, who's a senior research associate at the University of Cambridge's Faculty of Law. And Isaac, a couple of weeks ago, published a brilliant paper in the journal called Perspectives on Politics, which is a leading political science journal. Of course, many and perhaps most published works on antimicrobial resistance are to be found in maybe the medical literature. This is a clearly and a deeply researched piece of work coming from the social science perspective that's really taking a socio-ecological approach to look at this challenge and really challenging some of the dominant narratives about how it is that we conceive of antimicrobial resistance, and then in turn, what are the kind of policy responses that we currently have. And in his presentation, which will be presented for about 10 minutes, Isaac will walk through some of that challenge of the current paradigm and offer some alternative suggestions in their place. After Isaac, delighted that for this webinar, we have Dr. Claire Chandler as a discussant. Dr. Chandler is a professor of medical anthropology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Claire really is, I'd say, sort of the world leader in thinking about and conceptualizing AMR as a social challenge, based very much on her amazing ethnographic work, but also work of hers that incorporates historical, epidemiologic, and interventional approaches. And so Dr. Chandler has written some of the pieces that have really shaped a lot of policy responses, thinking of antimicrobials as infrastructure, for example. And so really delighted, Claire, that you're here today as a discussant, and you'll be speaking after Isaac. Before then, I turn it over to Isaac. Wanted to just do a couple of housekeeping items. First, this is intended to be an interactive webinar, so about half the time is reserved for audience questions and answers. To do that, I'd encourage everyone to take a look at the Q&A box on the platform, and you can add your questions there. What I'll do is, as your moderator, I'll be looking through them and reading them out and pointing towards either Claire or Isaac to answer them, and we'll have a great discussion. I also will remind everyone that there is a chat box as well, so feel free to participate in the conversation. And in fact, if you're willing, it would be great if everyone maybe takes this opportunity right now to introduce yourselves, where specifically, or maybe your name, what institution you're based at, what country you're from, just so that we can all see kind of who's in the room and benefit from that collective experience. And then finally, for those who are using social media to help share the news about this webinar, to ask questions, to challenge what you hear, please feel free to use the official hashtag #WarOnBugs, which itself is intended as a bit of irony in the fact that, as you'll see on this slide, Isaac's sort of starting point is whether we should be thinking about this as a war on bugs. And I guess everyone listening will decide for themselves at the end. So with that, Isaac, let me turn it over to you for sort of a 10-minute briefing about this brilliant paper that you just published 2 weeks ago. Isaac, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephen. Delighted to be here, and I'll be presenting this paper, as Stephen mentioned. And so I think I'll just jump right into it. Stephen gave a brilliant overview of antimicrobial resistance. And if you're attending this webinar, you're probably familiar with this challenge. But just to emphasize this issue, antimicrobial resistance is a natural evolutionary process that's hastened by human activity. And it occurs when microbes evolve and develop the ability to survive the drugs that we normally depend upon to treat infectious disease. And so what this essentially means is that our medicines stop working and previously curable infections transform into untreatable and often deadly diseases. And as Stephen mentioned, for over 100 years, governments have struggled and failed largely to mitigate and adapt to this challenge. It's now amongst the most urgent and pressing health challenges that we face, causing millions of deaths and costing billions of dollars every year. But as Stephen alluded to, antimicrobial resistance is more than just a health challenge. We investigate AMR, and we take this approach in this paper to look at antimicrobial resistance as a fundamental outcome of our relationship with the microbial world. And we look at microbes as part of the natural ecological basis that's partly responsible for ordering human social relations. And here's a simple graphic to help explain what I mean by this. We have various human social systems that use antimicrobials, various activities that affect microbes themselves. Microbes then evolve and become resistant to our medicines, which in turn comes back to affect human societies. And we affect microbes through various activities like antimicrobial use, land use change, wildlife trade, and climate change. And microbes react and affect us through antimicrobial resistance, zoonotic spillover, and vaccine evasion. When we look at the relationship in this way, we can see that the discovery of antimicrobials about 100 years ago enabled a shift in this relationship. And we built new social systems that were able to artificially affect and transform microbial ecologies. And we transformed these ecologies in order to enable various practices in healthcare, in agriculture. For example, antimicrobials these days are most often used in agriculture to improve yields and economic competitiveness. But as we use these technologies, we act upon microbial ecologies that transform, evolve, and come back to affect us through antimicrobial resistance. And what this reveals is that the social orders that we built on the ability to transform microbes and affect microbial ecologies is precarious. And it's precarious because antimicrobials stop working and microbial ecologies evolve and continue to evolve. And this precariousness manifests as increasing drug resistance, increasing mortality and morbidity, and declining agricultural yields as well. When we conceptualize the problem in this way as a problem of the relationship between humans and microbes, it offers the opportunity to ask different questions about how we respond to and manage this challenge. We go from just focusing on the medical questions about how we respond to new infectious diseases towards a question about how do we live in this relationship with microbes. We can ask, whether our human institutions are compatible with the natural dynamics of microbial life and evolution. And when we ask this question, we employ a specific concept called the concept of ecological fit, which is a very simple approach that basically says, here are the dynamics of microbial evolution and spread. Here are the social dynamics of human institutions that are responding to this challenge. And we ask, well, how well do these dynamics mesh together? How well do the dynamics of human institutions fit with the dynamics of microbial evolution and spread? And the answer is, unfortunately, not very well. We've developed systems that were meant to do one thing. They were meant to respond to infectious disease threats, but they weren't necessarily designed to, from this perspective of co-evolving with microbes. They weren't designed to look at the problem over the long term and think about it in terms of sustainability. And in that, with that graphic in mind about our relationship with microbial ecologies. And so we find that there are certain dynamics where microbes evolve quickly and spread quickly around the world, but by contrast, our human institutions are relatively slow at responding to these kind of urgent crises. As well, microbes are continually adapting and evolving in response to their environments. But by contrast, our innovation pipelines are stagnant. And so that pace of innovation is not meeting the pace at which microbes evolve and spread globally. And so in response to these challenges that we identify, this fundamental mismatch between what our institutions do and what the problem is, have led us to argue that we need a fundamental paradigm shift where we approach AMR as a socio-ecological challenge that demands sustainable management rather than a medical problem to be solved. And this is a great opportunity to challenge this war on bugs narrative because microbes, the ability for microbes to evolve typically outpaces our ability to develop new drugs and therapies. And what this means is that existing antimicrobials are becoming less effective faster than new ones are coming out. If we were to continue trying to engage in a war on bugs, we would enter into a never-ending arms race where the already inadequate pace of innovation would need to be radically accelerated and continually accelerated to keep pace with the rising demand for new therapies. So instead of focusing on innovating our way out of this problem, we look at the specific behaviors and actions that lead to antimicrobial use so that we can sustainably manage antimicrobial use and lessen the demand for new therapies and try to bring that pressure on innovation down to a more sustainable rate. The idea of this paradigm shift is that if we change our understanding of the problem, we can change the way we approach it. And in doing so, come up with new strategies and actions and behaviors and practices that can achieve effective solutions for antimicrobial resistance. And we argue that this paradigm shift can help achieve sustainability. And with this change in thinking of approaching antimicrobial resistance from a socio-ecological perspective and arguing to approach it like a sustainability challenge, we come up with 5 principles that can guide the development of future AMR institutions so that they're more in tune with the dynamics of microbial evolution. And these 5 principles are recognizing that there's no silver bullet. There's no one-size solution when it comes to solving antimicrobial resistance, but also it's about pointing out the fact that we use antimicrobials as though they're silver bullets to fix several different kinds of problems and prevent costlier investments in sanitation and hygiene or other techniques that can that can be used in agriculture that lessen the demand on antibiotics. The second principle is designing agile and adaptable institutions. The problem of AMR is continually changing, and it changes depending on what antimicrobials are used, how often they're used. And this means that the solutions, or what the problem looks like today, will be different tomorrow and into the future. So the problem evolves depending on our behaviors with respect to microbial ecologies, which means that our institutions also need to be able to adapt and be flexible over time. The third principle is diversifying practices. Just like biodiversity is good for nature, having multiple different plans and strategies in place can be very helpful for human societies. And this also helps to recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, that we'll need a diverse range of practices that are tailored to local circumstances to address this challenge. As we do this, we need to create a living and robust evidence base that can continually inform adaptations over time, and that's able to build an evidence base for the multifaceted challenge of AMR to allow us to isolate conditions for success where they exist. And finally, the fifth principle is to involve stakeholders. Antimicrobial resistance is one of those challenges that affects almost everyone, in that whether it's the food that we eat or the care that we seek from our doctors. This problem is so widespread, partly because of how ubiquitous antimicrobials are in our societies, that any effective global solution is going to have to include stakeholders in agriculture, in healthcare, in animal health, industry, civil society, all in varying different ways and capacities. But because it's such a widespread problem, we're going to need to enlist everybody in the solution. And so we argue that these 5 principles can help adjust institutions for immediate action, while also balancing that with this goal of long-term sustainability and mitigating the deeper drivers of AMR in the first place. And with these 5 principles, we argue that these 5 principles can guide a transformation towards long-term sustainability for antimicrobials and help us achieve sustainable antimicrobial use for the benefit of all. Great, thank you.
Great, Isaac, thanks so much for walking us through your amazing paper, and congratulations again on its publication in Perspectives on Politics. For anyone who found that overview interesting, of course, it's expanded further in probably 10,000 words or more, Isaac, in the manuscript itself. So an opportunity to dive further. But we do first, of course, have an opportunity to dive further thanks to you, Claire. And I'll turn over the floor to you and thank you for serving as a discussant for this work. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to Isaac and Stephen on the publication of this paper. So in my response to the paper, I'm going to provide a bit of a kind of live annotation, if you like, to its core points and reflections of my own alongside, because not everyone will have read it in detail yet. So I will provide a bit of a summary of each of the core sections of the article and its arguments, and sort of have a conversation with these. I'm coming to this as an anthropologist with an interest in science and technology studies, so I'll be bringing kind of another disciplinary perspective, which I hope will be helpful in extending the discussion that is instigated by the paper. So the paper builds on an impressive breadth of thinking from across disciplinary spaces to characterize the AMR problem and the ways that it is and could be handled at different scales. The authors are primarily concerned with policy, but to form their analysis, they explore a range of bodies of work on the way that AMR that the AMR problem has come into being, as well as on systems of governance. In the paper, the author's analysis leads them to draw a parallel between the interconnectedness that characterizes two different systems: the AMR ecosystem, comprising of microbes, drugs, human, non-human beings, together with the social, environmental, and political systems that they co-constitute, and the international regime complex for AMR governance, which they identify to comprise at least 7 different international regimes that have overlapping membership. Then they look at the fit between those two ecosystems. So starting with the AMR ecosystem, the authors follow others in characterizing this as a socio-ecological problem, which draws our attention to the fact that this is not only a microbial or a clinical problem, but that it's brought into being across multiple scales and through multiple processes that include the social, political, and economic processes that humans make, as well as the evolving processes of microbial communities. And the paper spends a bit of time on whether the world can be compartmentalized into the human and the non-human systems, and sort of questions how to reconcile the need for these divisions in order to answer the question about governance, and the pushback on observational studies that, that the world can be so easily separated. So, for example, while the paper recognizes the fallacies associated with thinking about nature as something to be controlled by culture, they go on to say a better way to conceptualize the relationship is to see human activity as occurring within specific material ecosystems. And I wondered, coming from kind of the anthropology of microbes perspective, whether building from this, we might see AMR as co-constituted by the systems that are at once human and non-human. And I find Hannah Landecker's work really inspiring to think about this, and recommend her paper, The Biology of History, for drawing attention to the ways that microbes have been written into our history. And in so doing, she gives a really good example of decentering humans in our analyses. So I'm wondering if that's a logical step for the way that this kind of socio-ecological analysis is going. So that the socio-ecological orientation perhaps still imagines humans at the center, because it describes them as embedded in other systems. And I wonder whether there's some value in what's been called nature culture's ways of thinking and thinking about how we co-produce each other. And this then problematizes an approach that sees humans as governing the microbial world, which possibly risks repeating tropes of superiority and imaginations that perhaps unhelpfully set us up to think that we can govern and manage the microbial world by controlling the social world. So I guess we're asking the question of how do we co-manage these between, given that that we can't control how the microbes are going to co-control that with us, if you like. So regarding relations with microbial life, I wonder whether an understanding of the world as not divided into the categories of nature and culture, which emerged from the utility of disciplinary specialisms rather than necessarily representing the truth of how the world works, whether this can push the theory and the question of managing human microbe relations. So others who've been thinking a bit about this from an anthropology perspective include Salla Sariola's group in Helsinki, and others who look at decentering the humans in imaginaries of disease and pandemic control. Regarding the focus on maximizing sustainability of effective antimicrobials, I also wonder whether this is not only we put humans at the center, but whether we're also potentially putting antibiotics at the center in our analysis. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. So that's the first part of the paper, kind of talks about how humans and microbes co-inhabit the world and our different systems, and recognizes that that's quite a messy space to then be attempting to govern. The second part of the paper explores that governance ecosystem. I think this is really, really useful. The authors identify 7 governance regimes for AMR. These are human health security, and you'll recognize these, are human health security, humanitarian biomedicine, animal health, agriculture, trade, development, and environment. So the authors scope out for each of those different regimes, they scope out the norms, the principles, norms, rules, and procedures that structure those regimes as it relates to AMR. For example, the humanitarian biomedicine regime has a principle of access to medicines as a human right. It has a norm that improving global health is a moral obligation, has a rule of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and procedures to be enacted through the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, amongst others. So they're systematically showing us these different regimes, and a key contribution, I think, of this paper is to distill these regimes and their characteristics in relation to AMR, lay them out systematically, and thereby make visible some of their overlaps and some of their gaps. The authors point out that some of the overlaps between the regimes have had positive effects, such as the synergistic overlaps in shared commitment of the human health security regime and the trade regime to minimize the impact of policy interventions on trade. They also draw attention to the conflicts between regimes, such as the issues around intellectual property, investment, and financing for new medicines, for example, the regulations around the TRIPS agreement, which have presented an impediment to providing access to medicine. The authors argue that in order to determine whose interests, principles, norms, rules, and procedures should prevail, that we need this paradigm shift in AMR governance. And I think this is perhaps where the authors sort of begin to imply the need for a new governance institution, perhaps one that fits the problem of AMR. The third part of the paper then tries to look at that, is that, you know, how does the ecosystem of AMR and the ecosystem of this governance fit together, and what's needed to see a future with a better fit so that governance is fitting the nature of the problem. And in short, the argument is that it doesn't. They outline 18 misfits that mean that the existing regime complex struggles to govern AMR. And these are divided into 4 types. These are spatial, meaning that broadly that microbes and antimicrobials escape jurisdictions. Temporal, meaning that reaction times are slow compared with the speed of microbial travel. They describe a threshold, which means that the sudden nature of AMR change isn't well buffered by our systems. And they're cascading, meaning that the nature of AMR, as produced by and impacting different systems, multiple systems, such as food security or social equity, is not well buffered either. So they assert that the existing problem solving of AMR has failed due to these kinds of misfits in the global health governance system, partly because they don't have the intersectoral arrangements needed to address these linkages. So I think that makes a neat sort of argument that we're seeing this kind of the problem of AMR as this kind of very, you know, everybody says it's complex. I think they've spelt out nicely that in more detail. The governance system can also be described as complex, but what they've done nicely is not describe it as complex, but give us some kind of traction for looking at that, and then told us about how misfits can occur. I guess I might not take quite such a pessimistic view about the misfits. I think one might draw other conclusions as well, other than necessarily the need for institutional responses, and we could come to discuss that. For example, I think the successes of the quadripartite working together is huge, and really can't be understated. It shows how connections can be drawn, reports can be co-authored, meetings can include different sectors around the table. And similarly, within countries, the One Health approach has seen new connections being made, increased awareness and cascading effects of and new strategic measures being considered. So perhaps there is room to recognise the already important progress in drawing connections between these different regimes that takes into consideration the ecological realities of AMR. And I think an excellent report that demonstrates that was the UNEP AMR report that was released last year, and I think it really does a good job of mapping that out. The importance of, I'm going to call it noise, of drawing these connections, I think can't be understated for changing the landscape in which policies are being implemented. It's easy to miss this, I think, as valuable in and of itself, because it's often something that is achieved in the process of working together towards an outcome or an action plan, that these connections, ideas, and new horizons are forged. But I think that they are there, and I think that that's a really, really good building block that this sector has achieved. So back in the paper, the authors are then proposing that this paradigm shift is needed. Instead of engaging in an unwinnable arms race that is implied in that rhetoric around the war on superbugs, we should shift our approach to designing social systems that can optimize antimicrobial use, minimize AMR, and maximize the effectiveness of antimicrobials. And from my perspective, I think I agree with all of that. And I think it would be great also to extend that vision, that it's not just social or medical systems that we need to look at, it's physical, engineering, architectural systems, and then political decisions, for example, on welfare, productivity, and so on, that are needed, because we aren't only trying to achieve the goals of minimizing antimicrobial resistance, but also, and perhaps moreover, to minimize the impact of antimicrobial resistance. If we accept the idea that we are going to be living with microbes that are drug resistant in the future, our job is to plan, to make good plans to ensure that the impact of that drug resistance is minimized as much as possible, and particularly on those people who shoulder that impact the most. So Isaac described the 5 principles that they're taking in the and proposing for governing AMR, and I don't think and you heard that, I don't think anyone could disagree with those as principles. So then the question is, how do we make that shift possible in the world as it is now? And I guess one tension I was wondering about, and something to discuss, is whether new institutions are needed to spearhead AMR based on these principles, or whether existing institutions can achieve that. And part of my thinking here is the balance between the benefits and risks of making AMR particular. So these complexities, which are not unique to AMR, can be made unique to AMR through having AMR-specific mechanisms, which could then have unintended consequences for other priorities. So the real challenge, I think, is to make this synchronize with other priorities. And we know that things that help for AMR can help for other things. So, and we know from long histories of isolating problems from their context is that to deal with the issues of silos ends up requiring parallel systems and so on, that then can be quite unhelpful as a load on the social economic systems. So I think the challenge then is, can we update existing systems to incorporate the new data and knowledge and projections about antimicrobial resistance? So yeah, I'm wondering also what unintended consequences might we anticipate if we did design different additional systems or institutions to achieve this. So at the end of the paper, I'm left with a sense of gratitude to the authors for laying out the challenges so clearly, still a sense of optimism, though we actually are making progress on AMR, but also feeling that to fit is perhaps a matter of fitting AMR back into the system in its different places, rather than necessarily extracting it further to act on it separately. And I would personally like to see plans for health systems that factor in AMR and its burden both now and into the future in what I would describe as probably quite a mundane and boring way. It doesn't need to be flashy or loud. It just needs to be done. We need to plan it. We need to accept that this is going to happen. And we need to make sure that we're protecting populations as much as we can from it. And I think that idea of buffering that the authors introduce is really, really important there. It's how do you buffer for these things that are unexpected, perhaps goes this way or this way. We can anticipate, though, to a degree, the epidemiology that we're dealing with in different places. And I think we need to be moving towards really, really clear plans for that. And to do that, we probably need to stop calling it AMR as an overall thing and dive into STIs, UTIs, sepsis, diarrheal disease, and so on, which is where AMR is happening. And that's the reality of how we're going to have to deal with it into the future. So I have a few questions that I've asked through there that I can come back to, but I think I'll pause and just see if Isaac and Stephen want to make any kind of comments about
Great. Claire, thanks so much. I think that was it was amazing the way both that you brought it together and asking the questions. We're going to have an interesting conversation here, I think, right now. So much appreciated for that. For those in the audience, I did just want to remind you, this is your time to ask questions and get answers. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the window for which that gives you the opportunity to ask those questions. And I will do my best to ensure that they can all be answered. In the meantime, though, until we get some questions up there, I think, Claire, I was particularly struck by the way you framed it as that antimicrobial resistance is really co-constructed by human systems and microbial systems, and thinking of it as a co-construction and rejecting that kind of natural social or cultural divide actually then allows us to see it for what it is and kind of make it, you said at the end, make it part of the mundane planning. And so I know our colleague, Professor Kevin Otteson often refers to, like, we know that water pipes are going to eventually need to be replaced at some point. I don't know if it's 50 years or 100 years. I'm not a water pipe expert, but we know they don't exist for forever and they need to be replaced. And we just build it into our planning that eventually we're going to have to replace it, and we create financing systems specifically to replace those water pipes when they need to be replaced. Maybe Claire, first to you, and then Isaac. This kind of conception that you're bringing forward here is a bit jarring, though, for example, if there's any physicians joining in, or pharmacists, others who are kind of used to thinking of this and do on their daily practice have to face like the immediate infection in front of them. Thinking of it instead as a co-construction of human and microbial systems, I think really kind of jars. So how do you kind of think about bringing, like, how does this conception kind of bring in all the different communities that need to come together in order to tackle the problem? Claire first, and then maybe Isaac. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. I think I actually don't know that everybody needs to be thinking about this the same way. I think somebody who's faced with a patient who's got an infection and it may be drug resistant is facing a very different circumstance to someone who is in the job of planning for the next pipes. Everybody's got their different piece of the puzzle, and different pieces of AMR and faces of AMR face different people. And so I don't think there's, you know, a one way of thinking about AMR that is possible or even useful for everybody to have to share. I think that the reality of AMR is going to feel very different to many different people, and I think that's just how it is. But I think for those people whose job it is to do that planning, I think recognizing the way that, you know, AMR is co-constructed, co-constituted between these different human and non-human entities allows us to sort of work out how we need to plan and how much we need to buffer, and to accept that that future is happening. I think what we've seen a lot in the rhetoric around antimicrobial resistance is almost implied like we could stop it and reverse it. I think accepting that it's going to be there and we need to plan for it is quite a different conceptual move in terms of how we think about the future. The future has been there as a spectre to be run away from so far. We've brought the future into the present as a horror that we want to avoid when we've talked about AMR. I think we're now at the stage where we have to recognize we're not going to be able to avoid it. We're going to need to reduce the burden that it poses.
Right, just like, I guess, we don't fight the idea that water pipes will eventually corrode and need replaced. We just plan for it as part of mundane planning. Yep. Isaac.
Yeah, there's so many really interesting and insightful threads to pick up on. I think the point about co-construction and co-constitution is super fascinating, and it's kind of an issue that we encountered earlier on in this approach, because even in my graphic, I separated humans from microbes, and we say in the paper that a better way to conceive of it is similar to co-constitution, and it goes beyond just like these intricacies, these the connections beyond just nature and culture, but even this idea of like human and microbes. We have tons of microbes in our bodies that affect our health and our moods in all certain kinds of ways. And so even just saying like humans, microbes can even create this sense of separateness that doesn't exist. And beyond ourselves, microbes are super important for soil health, for other organisms. And so this idea of co-construction is really interesting to me. And I think how to exactly square that with this attempt to also investigate these ecosystems separately is challenging. I don't have a really good answer for it. The way that we approached it in the paper was to do it, but acknowledge the reasons why doing this could be misleading or potentially not the best. And then another really fascinating thing about water pipes and antibiotics, two things that you would not really think are associated, but what Stephen said and what Claire said earlier on about treating antimicrobials or changing the way that we approach antimicrobials and looking at things like our built environment and all these other aspects that we don't normally think of. What this to me, it kind of signals an opportunity to go a little bit further. And instead of using water pipes, I was just use the example of roads as this kind of common infrastructure that we have that deteriorates over time. We've built into our budgets. We need to finance our roads. We need to maintain them so that we can continue using them. Similar with antibiotics. But what the analogy of roads allows us to do is question, okay, why do we have roads and why have we built car-centric cities? And how does this affect our environment and our health? And so similarly, when we approach antibiotics like this, we say, well, antibiotics need continual maintenance to support modern ways of life. But it allows us to also question, well, what are those modern ways of living that are so reliant on antimicrobials?
Isaac, I was wondering there where you were going with the roads analogy, and it makes great sense. And then you actually beautifully brought it back to, I guess, Claire, some of your work on antimicrobials as infrastructure, which I mentioned in the opening remarks. I think I love the question from Dr. Raman from Bangladesh. That's the first that's come in through the Q&A, because it kind of builds very nicely on this in kind of, he asks or is challenging that on one hand, of course, we need this kind of coexistence, co-management with microbes, but there is going to, from a practical perspective, in light of the various things happening around the world, there's going to be ecosystem disruption to this kind of coexistence or co-management. And the question then from Dr. Raman is, how do we address this? Like, how do we co-manage in light of the fact we know there's going to be disruption from different places, even if we all kind of come together and let's say have a big international treaty, we're still going to have disruption to this balance. I don't know who wants to take it first, but maybe over to our speakers.
Sure. This question touches on an issue. I think when we adopt this approach, the socio-ecological approach, we look to other challenges like the environment and the climate, and the rhetoric there is, we need to have a more harmonious relationship. We need to live in harmony with the world, and that kind of thing, which is all great for those areas. But antibiotics is a little bit different because we still want to be able to treat infectious disease, and so there is an inherent disruption of ecosystems that's necessary. And so we're stuck in this relationship with microbes where on one hand, many microbes are beneficial, but on the other, some of them cause deadly diseases that we want to treat. But in treating them, we disrupt microbial ecosystems and ecologies that potentially lead to resistance. And so the rhetoric of living in harmony doesn't perfectly transfer because of this caveat.
Yeah, and I guess we might ask whether we're doing enough research and whether we're investing enough into those, to use your analogy of cars and roads, those alternative things. Do we always need roads? Do we always need antibiotics? Are we doing enough research into immunity, into who is at greatest risk of dying from a drug-resistant infection, into how we help people to be buffered from those risks? We know people can carry drug resistance. We know people carry bacteria all the time. Not all of them get sick. So, and not all of them will be very, very sick and get sepsis. So how do we, are we doing enough to look at those pathways towards why some people have much worse outcomes than other people, and to try and do, to use your word, that buffering. So I think it's quite right that we do a lot of work on, new antimicrobials to replace that pipeline, but at the same time, making sure that we're looking at pharmaceutical, non-pharmaceutical, other ways of preventing infections, more vaccines, other ways to, to reduce the impact of infections when people do get them. That's going to be about equity. That's going to be about issues around obesity and other things that can mean that that infections can be worse for some people than others. So it does intersect, I think, a lot with other areas of public health, which comes to why I was kind of pushing that idea of how do we inject AMR into the other discussions rather than extracting it and having it in its own discussion. I do think there's a time and a place to do that and say this is a big issue, let's work together. I also think the time might be coming to reinsert that into all of these other agendas and make sure that we are supporting them rather than the potential to contribute to a sort of competitive marketplace of AMR versus other things, when AMR is actually just a subset of almost everything else.
As I wait for other audience members to ask questions, I'll take the opportunity to pick up on this idea that we're increasingly using analogies or frames in order to kind of get at the core, and both in terms of understanding as well as communicating what we're talking about. I think, Isaac, one of the things that you do well with, which Claire commented on, is you're really drawing on language and concepts from biodiversity in the paper. And that kind of intellectual move of drawing from a different sector, it's not the first time you've done that. In some of your previous work, you've looked at what we can learn from global climate change governance, adapting it for global antimicrobial resistance governance. And so maybe I'll first point to Claire, though, to ask the question of to what extent do we need to continue to learn from other sectors or other conceptions and applying it in AMR? I think you nicely identified in your presentation that there's both some strengths and weaknesses of doing that. Any reaction about to what extent there's further value in that kind of thing, and any comments on, if there is value, kind of where we need to go next to get the best, I guess, value for the intellectual effort? Claire?
I think there's always going to be things to learn from across different sectors. We've got to keep doing that. The worst thing we can do in any area is to lock down the walls and go straight for our thing. So I think I think there always will be ways of thinking, the ways of thinking from climate change around adaptation versus mitigation. We've been taking more of a mitigation route with AMR. Are we now talking really a bit more about adaptation? I think, thinking with concepts from across spaces is very useful. But I also think the engagement needs to be now thinking about, if we take seriously the need to plan, then we really should be saying, okay, well, STIs, what do we need to do there? So it's actually quite different to diarrhea. And it's actually quite different to sepsis on neonatal wards. The things that we need to do and the plans that actually need to be made to provide that buffering, if you like, are different in those different spaces. It means championing maternal child health at the same time as championing WASH, at the same time as championing IPC and cleaners and cleaning. Those are all areas that all those different AMR expertise are happening in already. And I think it's a double-edged sword to group it all together under one umbrella, Because on the one hand, it helps with advocacy. On the other hand, it makes something non-specific out of what are different problems in different sectors. So I think there will come a time, which we may be nearly at, where we need to reinsert the AMR lessons learned, the evidence that we have created across all of these different spaces, reinsert that evidence into the places that it's needed. Hopefully we can do ourselves out of a job and we don't need to make AMR a massive thing anymore and have lots of webinars about it. Wouldn't that be good?
I love that. Yes, working so successfully, we work ourselves out of a job. Although in some respects, Claire, that's going back to the fact that this is something that can be won. Although your point earlier about making it
we don't put
mundane, part of
ourselves,
planning.
we don't need the AMR specific
That's
people.
right.
It becomes
Yeah.
its own separate thing in different places. That would be my vision.
Okay. Isaac, what about yourself? About maybe going back to, well, both made to comment on what Claire just said, which I thought was really helpful and certainly aligns with my vision too, Claire. But also about this learning from other sectors, concepts, which I think you've done so well in your work.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's lots of opportunities for learning. It does come with some challenges, but also opportunities. I think when we look at biodiversity, climate governance, it's unfortunate that there hasn't been as much progress as we would have liked. And so it's very hard to say, oh, we should do what we're doing in climate change and AMR governance because, well, it doesn't work perfectly there. And so in translating lessons, we also need to tailor them and see how they can be improved. And that is actually relatively difficult to find strong examples of that in those areas. Not impossible, they exist, but it's not as easy as just transplanting approaches. On top of this, I think what this does is when we look at issues across different sectors or different domains, it offers an opportunity to look for potential synergies. So I think I've made this point in conversation with Stephen before, but if we're going to look to see, what are the issues that we face in climate change, in biodiversity governance, in energy governance, or in health and antimicrobial resistance, are there dynamic causes that they share? Are there behaviors that are implicated in the causes or acceleration of all of these challenges? And so that cross-sectoral learning, it not only offers the opportunity to draw lessons, but also tackle multiple issues at once.
So I'm a lawyer by background, so I love it when people disagree. So one point of disagreement between the two of you is on optimism about the misfits of the or pessimism about the misfits that are seen. And so I think, Isaac, in your paper, when you see 18 misfits between kind of what the current global AMR governance and the different regimes have versus what's sort of needed, well, Claire, it's hard to not be pessimistic a little about that. But Claire, you were much more optimistic, or at least optimistic about what the next step is. And in some respects, I think you both kind of probably have much closer aligned views about, hey, the where to next, in the sense, Isaac, the 5 principles, none of them were to blow up the current system, right? I mean, they were all about, and I think in your presentation, you really highlighted it was about using sort of principles for immediate, small, incremental, short-term changes that could actually over time lead to a broader transformation. And so maybe just to be a bit pointed on it, what are your thoughts about the question that Claire posed about, is it about leveraging existing institutions and systems with slight changes? Because Claire, I agree with you that some of the work the quadripartite has been doing recently, bringing 4 different international agencies together combined, has been very impressive and important, and something that should be built on. At the same time, when you look at 18 misfits, it raises questions. Love to turn over to you on that question that Claire posed. Maybe Isaac first to you, and then Claire for the maybe final comments. Isaac.
Yeah, just to be explicit, I am optimistic about the future. I think there's so many opportunities for these principles or similar ideas to be implemented, whether it's at the global level through the IHR revisions or a new pandemic instrument or a standalone agreement on AMR, but then also at national and local levels. And so it kind of also gets to what Claire was saying about, pulling AMR out of its context versus addressing it in the overlapping context that it arises in. I think there's room for that, and I think there's room to adapt local, national, global institutions that already exist along the lines of the principles that we outlined. So making sure that they're flexible over time. This applies to a hospital protocol as well as it does to any international agreement that's made. And I guess the point wasn't to say that the institutions are, or it wasn't to say that the institution should be disregarded or we should leave them to the wayside to develop new ones. It was about identifying specific challenges, specific misfits that could be tweaked or tweaks in the system that could address those misfits. Like Stephen said, with the objective of making immediate impact, but then also building the foundation necessary so that these institutions or any institution in the future is set up to govern this problem in the way that it exists.
Thanks. Claire, last word to you. We just have a minute left. Over to you. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think that was we obviously are both optimistic about how that can happen, so that's very good. I suppose the last area of question mark really is does this require specific institutions? Still, I'm not clear quite how we go forward with that. So maybe that's the next debate is around what kind of institutions are required, if any new ones. But I think we already have a lot of institutions, so and I think they're doing a great job. It's like there has been a lot of progress in a short amount of time, although obviously not a lot of progress in a long amount of time. So I think it was a very useful analysis, and I think pointing out where those principles can be applied will be really, really valuable and useful into the future. Thank you.
With that, let me thank both of our presenters. Isaac, a big congratulations on your piece that came out a couple of weeks ago. Claire, thanks so much for joining and spending the time to wade through it and provide that discussant voice, which I think enabled this conversation to be so interesting over the last hour. For those who listened in and liked what they heard, the paper is available. It's open access, so there's no paywall. If you joined live, there is a link in the chat to access that paper, along with plain language summaries of it, and a video actually of Isaac further explaining the study that have been posted in the chat. For those watching this afterwards in recorded version, we'll make sure to post those links as well, right with the video. If you're interested in continuing this conversation about is coexisting with microbes the key to addressing AMR, again, feel free to continue engaging through social media using the hashtag #WarOnAMR, perhaps now with a question mark at the end. But otherwise, stay tuned for other additional webinars from the Global Strategy Lab, which we'll continue to offer in the future. Thanks so much for being here. Looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephen.